Keys to the Shop, episode 403, a conversation on food, coffee, and writing with author Matt Rodbard. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show. Always happy to have you along. Of course, I would recommend that you would subscribe to Keys to the Shop, and that way you'll never miss out on great conversations and content like the one you're tuning into for today. There's about 10 episodes a month that get published across Keys to the Shop, and definitely don't want to miss any of them. So go ahead and hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and also share these episodes online with your team, with your friends on social media, and let people know about this resource of Keys to the Shop. Over 700 episodes of interviews and diving into topics all relevant to helping you run a thriving and amazing coffee retail experience. Now, I want to mention also that Keys to the Shop is not just a podcast, but it's also a consulting and coaching company working one-on-one with entrepreneurs and operators like yourself to help you either start your business off on the right foot with foundations for success, or helping you take your current business and refine it, elevate your operations, people, and quality, take you to the next phase with clarity, and to give you the freedom to enjoy that process of owning and running your coffee bar. It's so thrilling to get to work with people one-on-one in this capacity. I would love to explore that with you. If you want to sign up for a free discovery call with me, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS at keystotheshop.com. We'll sit down and talk all about what you've got going on at your business and how Keys to the Shop Consulting can help you. Again, that email for Keys to the Shop Consulting, it's chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, you've heard me talk about this on the show many times. And as we're talking about food and coffee and writing, and we're going to be talking with our guest about just, the worlds of culinary and the emotions that are conveyed in these hospitality experiences, one of the parts of those experiences, obviously, is the taste. And sometimes you get that taste that's really surprising. It's because a lot of things happen. There's a lot of intentionality and sourcing and preparation. And when you use the right equipment, you get to repeat those experiences more often. And that's why I'm excited about the Ground Control Cyclops brewer from Voga Coffee. This brewer uses SCA award-winning technology to give the user control over an incredible depth and range of flavors that truly bring coffee to life and give you access to its true potential. So it elevates that batch brew experience for all of your customers. But not only this, it also, because of that extraction technology, allows you to make tea, batched iced lattes, batched cold brew. That opens up so many different avenues of profitability and efficiency in your store. Check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee for more information. Right now, for a limited time, they are giving 50% off their brewers. So this is an incredible offer. 50% off this amazing brewer is just astounding. So again, go to groundcontrol.coffee to learn more. This is a quality upgrade, efficiency, productivity, profitability, and it just looks beautiful at the same time. Highly recommended. Again, groundcontrol.coffee. Creating beverages is what people expect us to do day in and day out at the coffee shop. And when they come in, they're going to be in various states of mind and mood, but they want something stable and consistent and quality. That's what they come to us for. And they trust that we've done the work beforehand to source great products. If you're serving plant-based beverages, one of the best things you can do is serve your guests the Barista Series from Pacific. It's the line of plant-based performance beverages that's designed for baristas, is tested by amazing baristas from all over the world before it reaches your shelf. So you're very confident in its ability to deliver quality, to stand up to the heat from steaming, produce great texture, and also create balance in the beverage focused on the coffee. It's a wonderful product. Check them out at pacificfoodservice.com for more information. Get samples for yourself and try it. I highly recommend, if you're looking for the best plant-based experience in your cafe, definitely got to use the Barista Series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today I am really excited because we are talking all about food, the world of food and dining and culinary. We're talking about coffee. We're talking about coffee shops and writing, conveying knowledge and emotion. So, all of this in one conversation is sure to create a great experience for you, the listener. And I'm so pleased to welcome to the show Matt Rodbard. Matt Rodbard is a writer, editor, and an author of food and culture books. He has more than 2 decades of experience working in television, magazines, book publishing, and online media. He's the author of Koreatown, a cookbook, which is a New York Times bestseller, the book Food IQ, which is a Publishers Weekly bestseller, and the founding editor of online food and culture magazine Taste, which is the winner of 2 James Beard Foundation awards. He's the host of the long-running podcast Taste, which is a show featuring conversations with the most interesting people in food, cookbooks, media, and more. And so, with all this experience in exploring these worlds, the culinary world and the world of people who are creating restaurant experiences, Matt also is a really serious enthusiast and is very knowledgeable about the world of what's available out there in coffee and retail coffee. And so, in this conversation today with Matt, we're going to dive into a bit of his story. We're going to talk about the goals that he has in creating the content that he has over the years, specifically with Taste and the books that he's written. We're going to talk about the intersection between coffee and food and what we in coffee can learn from the culinary world regarding hospitality, regarding the actual product and the way we approach communicating that product to our customers. And in this conversation, Matt actually turns the tables on me and asks me a few questions about coffee, which is really fun towards the end of the episode. So there's a really dynamic conversation about these two worlds and the future of how we, as craft people, the people who are communicating about and creating craft experiences, connect it to consumers in a way that empowers them, as well as empowering the people who this food represents. We're talking about supply chains there, obviously, and the sustainability of the industries we know and love. And so obviously Matt has a lot of great insights to this. So I think you're really going to benefit greatly from his wisdom. So again, thrilled to have him on the show. Really looking forward to sharing this with you. So without anything else, let's get right to it. Here now is my interview with Matt Rodbard. All right, Matt, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How is your morning this morning?
Chris, it's awesome to be here, and I really love what you do, and it's a great morning. I'm drinking some Canberra coffee, so it's a great morning.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds great. And the feeling's mutual. You are producing a lot of great content. And most recently, I listened because you have the Taste podcast and you had Nigel on from Drip Coffee in New York. And I appreciate the culinary world so much. And so many of us in coffee are deriving inspiration from that sector of food and beverage. And I feel like today is a perfect opportunity to sort of get a real in-depth view from the other side, especially around someone who's curated a lot of content around that. And so maybe a good question to start would be like an origin story, I suppose, in terms of how your own passion for writing and specifically about food in the culinary world began.
Great question, and I love that you draw the comparison, I think, with what we do at Taste and on the Taste podcast. I love bringing coffee professionals, not just because it's a passion of mine as a recreational drinker and fan of cafe culture and some roasting, but I think it's such a intertwined world of food and coffee that I think the food side, people in my seat, food writers, don't necessarily understand fully the full picture of it. So I fully want to talk about that because I think there's ways the coffee industry can talk to writers better. I think there's a lot of ways writers can look at coffee in a way that they've, fetishized wine and bourbon and all these other topics and kind of forgotten about coffee a little bit. So briefly, I launched Taste, the publication I run at Penguin Random House in 2016, and I've been there since and doing the podcast and in the meantime, I've published books. I'm working on my third cookbook. I've written 2 books about Korean food and 1 book about general cooking tips with my buddy Dan Holzman, who's a chef. But really, my passion for writing started in college, really. I was an English major. I worked in newspaper. And since then, which was in the late 90s, I have really loved writing. And I've done it for a variety of outlets and formats and television, and here we are today.
Let me kind of dive into that a little bit. And I like writing, and then there's certain depths to that. Like some people say, I like coffee, and then like you more than like coffee. There's a little bit more to that. So what is it about writing that maybe you love, that you really stick with it? Because it's a sustainable thing for you. You've done it for so long. Obviously, there's something that happens in the writing process that keeps you there.
Great point. Maybe writing is not the right word. It's the profession of journalism, which is what I've kind of been in for pretty much my whole career. I enjoy that world because it allows me entree into many different worlds that I would never, ever, ever have the ability to enter as a civilian. I kind of have this card that I carry in essence, where I can call any expert up in any field, and they're mostly more than willing to talk to me about their passions in their field. So is it somebody who's been running a bakery for 45 years in Israel, or is it a farmer in the Midwest in Michigan who's been growing grapes, or is it a young chef who has a new restaurant? I get to chameleon in a way into their world, and to me, that's the drug. I mean, that's what's really been my love of this world. The writing itself is hard, right?
Sure.
You write and and it's never easy. And, it shouldn't be easy, really. It's still, you got to work at it all the time, like working out, like going to the gym. You have to write every day. The journalism part is what I really, really, really connect with. I don't write fiction. I don't really write screenplays. I write editorial. That's kind of my bag right now.
Right. And in that sense, though, still, even though you write nonfiction, it's still story. It's still the story of the thing that you're exploring yourself, which you're putting yourself in the seat of the reader as they want to transport themselves to that vineyard or that coffee shop or the place that's making the fresh mozzarella or something like that. And that's what helps those people, convey the message that they're trying to convey just by doing the work. And so I feel the same thing about, call somebody up and say, you want to be on the podcast. I'm always a little surprised that they would say yes. I'm like, but people don't get their story told very often because they're in the midst of it.
Right. Good point. I think it's really great to have the interview subject take a pause from their busy day. Often small business owner who doesn't have time to take that self-reflection point and have me stick a microphone in their face or have a recorder running and ask them a bunch of questions in a therapeutic way. In some ways, I think that it can be that therapeutic for an interview to kind of process some of the work they're doing.
Yeah.
And I feel that. I think those are like the best interviews when there's like realness and it's not too, talking point heavy.
Right. I like the realness aspect you just mentioned there, that, and you can kind of sense when you're in the midst of that versus something that's canned and, instantly ready to go. Now, in terms of, you reaching out to people and, there's a story there, there's content, and there's kind of a step of faith that you have that says, yep, I know there's something here. I'm going to dig further. That's the journalistic instinct. And maybe that's just curiosity for those of us who are not journalists, but in particular with food, why the subject of culinary and food in terms of how you exercise that curiosity and explore a subject?
Well, Chris, I started my career working in entertainment, and I worked at MTV and I worked at Spin Magazine, and I was covering music and culture, and I loved it, and I still do. I'm a huge fan of all those things, but I found interviewing bands and musicians and even movie stars and all that world, it felt back to that canned moment. It felt a little like that. And then I started in like the early 2000s writing about chefs, and I started getting in front of young or even not young chefs. And it felt like there was a connection there that I'd never had with the other subjects. I think we all eat, obviously, and this is well before foodie culture and foodism has become mainstream culture. But even back then, and definitely today, food is a reflection of yourself. It's a mirror. And I think you are making these choices daily, what you're eating, and now what you're Instagramming, what you're posting is a reflection of yourself. And I think that there's a connection as a writer to this, like food. It's just like an endless well of opportunity to write and to cover. And I think there's always an interest in it.
Is it a reflection of yourself because it's done so frequently that it just is a more authentic kind of expression?
Right now in 2023, it's definitely a reflection because we, for a lot of reasons, have kind of moved, we're post material, I feel, in some ways in culture. And I think there's obviously the metaverse, and we're talking a lot about that. But there's very few things that people really value, or at least the younger folks out there. I think there's definitely a diminishing of like, check out this watch, it's cool, that's why I'm cool. Like I think that instinct
Yeah.
is becoming less and less part of our culture. I think there's obviously issues with wealth disparity and people can't afford to keep up with material items, but we make dinner every night. We go out to restaurants, be it a fancy restaurant that's high end or a corner taqueria or a falafel shop. So I think it's become an easier way or a more enjoyable way to reflect your values by talking about food. What did you just eat last night? What restaurant are you excited about? Which cookbook are you going to buy? That's why the cookbook industry is booming so hard right now, which is where I work. I think there's a big shift here. I think that has something to do with the modern zeitgeist in food.
Interesting. As you're talking about that, I'm thinking, and it might have been something that you had written or it had been an episode of yours as I was kind of preparing for our talk today. The thing that's out there is, Rene Redzepi's closing Noma, and the fine dining industry is under this pall of like, is this even something we want? And of course, it's always going to be there. But the idea is, at the same time, the Michelin Guide is awarding more stars to taquerias and street vendors and things like that. So when you talk about the idea of post material, it feels similar to what's going on there, in that people are trying to find something a little bit more meaningful through, in this case, food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the media, you're in the awards, be it Michelin or James Beard Awards or other bodies, are acknowledging that we were kind of stuck in this high end warp zone, in the twilight zone. And it was in reflecting culture, and it was becoming embarrassing to see only high-end restaurants reflected in these Michelin guides and in these stars. I think this is a separate conversation about the work that a quote unquote high-end restaurant puts in, because you have to acknowledge how important that is and how dedicated and how enjoyable those experiences are. And many of your listeners work in the service industry, work in coffee or in fine dining. And so, to be clear, it's not an indictment about fine dining. I think it's art, it's beautiful, but the awards bodies and what you're speaking of have kind of leveled it out. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah, and to bring it back to the idea of, the listeners are majority independent coffee shop operators, entrepreneurs, managers, et cetera. And, there's a lot of inspiration that, competitors in those areas that are employees of those shops, myself included, back in the day, I used an overturned wine glass with smoke when I found out that they did that at Alinea, when the first smoking gun was like making its way into the world in 2007.
Yeah.
And that was just like, oh, that's cool, I'm going to use that. But today we are still inspired by these things, but then we can also lose a little bit of the why behind what we're doing in that inspiration. And it feels like the people that you're interviewing and the people that you're writing about are on that quest to arrive at a point of authenticity and meaning rather than the trappings. And I'm curious to kind of hear from your perspective, how has the tone and the message kind of changed as you've reflected these stories in your writing from that, maybe the aesthetic focus, to something a little bit more soulful?
Yeah, it's a great question. But first, I just need to, of course, shout out this audience, because I think independent, either multi-roaster cafes or roaster cafes or anybody working in coffee, I mean, much respect. I hope I can speak for the food industry and for food journalism, is that we love what you do. We just need to write about you better. So I'm going to get that in there first, as you mentioned, your audience. Yeah, we're kind of post negative space plating, and we're kind of post aesthetics driving the conversation. I think it's often been, it was parodied on that wonderful film, The Menu, which I think highly recommend anyone in service watching. It's great. I think Chef's Table is a wonderful show, but like the way that they've kind of elevated fine dining has become a punchline. And I think we, again, feel a little embarrassed that only these high-end experiences are becoming the quote-unquote best in the world. So I think there's been a real reckoning. And really, the work I've done over the years, I think I've tried to really balance it. And I haven't, I've been writing about food for over 15 years. And I think, and I've written about Korean food and Korean American communities for 12 years. And I think it's focusing on origin and focusing on really the small mom and pops and the folks who are creating food from like soulful food that has a real identity and a real point of view, and not being enchanted by that plating or by the cool soundtrack and the space. And I think criticism has changed dramatically too in New York in particular. It's where I read the most. And there's certain critics back in the day, I would say even 5 years ago and definitely 15 years ago, who they were more like architecture critics. Like they were reviewing spaces. They were talking about the fabrics on the walls and all that stuff. And important for sure, but certainly not going to make or break a dining experience. So I feel like we've in the media have kind of gone away from like, highlighting and vaunting the high end $30 million build out type of restaurant and gone more for the soulful local restaurants.
I love that. And, back in the day, I remember in barista competitions in the early 2000s, the stories were, we did all sorts of like table settings. You had to have your own table. We don't do that today necessarily, but there was heavy points on the aesthetic. I remember somebody got a point off in the competition because they missed a belt loop in their belt for
oh my gosh,
improper
that's
attire.
Crazy.
Yeah. And it was like, jumped the shark at that point in my mind. I was like, this is not going to make or break the experience. And today we'd be aghast at that. Like we couldn't imagine that. But it was an insecurity of ours as an industry. And so it feels like the chefs and people doing this work are a little bit more comfortable in their own skin in terms of what they're putting out there. What message is it that you think, by and large, what do they desire as the outcome of their craft? I know that's like different for each person, but is there a commonality between the people that's what they want customers to be impacted by the most?
Great question. I'll answer that, and then I'll get to another point because I want to talk about age because I think it's important and barrier of entry. But to answer that question, I think final outcome is honestly, if you're going to talk to somebody who has had some experience, it's like positive EBITDA at the end of the day, paying staff an equitable wage. I think that there's so much progress that's been made in terms of equity. It's not great. I would say it's good, but it used to be extremely poor. So I think at the end of the day, that's important for an owner and a chef. In terms of food on the plate, I think it's identity, it's having a point of view, it's creativity, but doing it in a way that gets style points, but maybe in a different way, where an elevated fabric or an elevated textile, an elevated flatware, plateware is less important. And it's more important to have food that's delicious, first and foremost, but secondly, has a real point of view. And actually, you could like talk about it to a friend 5 days later, as opposed to it being too abstract. I think that's one thing that we, especially for new American cuisine, where like the reinvention of the hamburger or the egg roll that's a Reuben, like there's been a lot of talk about fusion, and I don't think we need to get into that conversation. It's a totally different show. But I think right now it's like, it's not about authenticity. That's a tough word because I think there's certain hangups with that word. And I think people are their own authentic selves, but I think it's all about having a real vision and point of view and having a real sense of place.
If I'm in a relationship with somebody as a friend or a significant other, I feel like I'm going to impact them somehow just based on our interactions. And the authentic expression of our relationship is ever changing, right? Like you mentioned the word authentic. It's like there's a lot of reinvention that happens and leaving room for the operator to reinvent themselves instead of saying, why don't you just play the hits? Why don't you just play Freebird and just be done with it? Mm-hmm. So I appreciate the mentioning the trickiness of authenticity. But even for yourself, as you write about this, you want to impact people a certain way and have them walk away from your writing, maybe talking about that or trying that recipe or going to that restaurant. And it sounds like a very emotional goal, honestly.
For sure. Writing is emotional. Putting out a podcast is emotional. Putting out a magazine is emotional. Putting out a cookbook is emotional. It's a great word. And I think it's not talked about enough. I think we put a lot of our time and effort into these projects, and there's time, there's labor, but there's also emotion. And for me, having done this for a while, we have business goals with our content. Like, this isn't done without, like, Taste in particular has a business goal. Like, we can't just write what we want. Serving the audience is super important to accomplish that business goal. And so if I can accomplish that business goal, meaning engaging an audience, having a newsletter that people open and read, tipping people off about the cookbooks we publish at Penguin Random House, I've accomplished that business goal. But I want to make sure I'm doing it in a way that I feel proud about, and it's not just marketing, or it's not just, fluff. And I think that's where the emotion comes in. Like, I want to serve the audience, but I also want to serve myself as a writer. I want to be satisfied with the piece or the podcast, but I also want to make sure it's not too esoteric or too insidery or too self-absorbed. So I think that's the fine line, and that's where the emotion comes in, because I think a lot of writers are emotional because they put so much time in, and obviously the money is not great in our field. It never really has been, but it certainly isn't now. So there's a lot of, like, labor of love and sweat equity put into these projects, and I think it gets emotional. It's a great word.
You're a word chef, right? You're basically.
Yeah. Basically.
Yeah, in writing about chefs, and I can appreciate that. It's also a business. Like, a restaurant would need to make money, a coffee shop needs to make money. So there are coffees that you would, like, maybe roast, for example, that you're proud of, but maybe it's not the thing that really gets you in particular excited, but your customers are excited about it. It's practical in that sense, like, or the dish that everybody loves, like what was Thomas Keller's Oysters and Pearls or something like that.
Yeah, those are
probably still sells it, because you can't not have that, because that's what people will go to Yountville and whatnot. But the point is that, well, actually, I'm kind of curious from your perspective what the balance is between as you shed light on this conundrum of, like, now these places might get popular, and they get 2 or 3 locations and they scale. I mean, how does one balance the need for sustaining yourself through business while also remaining true to an ethos through that process?
I think it's keeping one location. To be honest, I think the scaling impulse of a business owner needs to be really checked when it comes to restaurants. I think it's a low margin business. I mean, coffee is no different. And to have the impulse that you need to scale from 1 to 2 to 4, I mean, I think you talk to anyone, especially in New York and LA and San Francisco, people I'm close with, and the real estate market doesn't allow you to scale. So maybe shutting off that impulse for the time being and just focusing on that one location and keeping that one location really close and personal and making sure it does the best job. I think, to me, I admire that restraint and that patience. Of course, if there's any kind of capital investment in your business and you need to, the numbers need to go up naturally, that's a whole different pickle. But if you're, like, funded by yourself and it's all about your own bank, I feel that impulse to scale, it seems like there's way more, like, negative horror stories than positive stories, from my vantage at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of mile wide, inch deep type of establishments. Yes. The pandemic kind of knocked all those down.
They sure did.
And there's a lot of people that got knocked down that I wish did not. And there's others that were just shown to be like, yeah, that was actually just a fake Western town with the facade of an old saloon or whatever.
Yeah.
So when we're talking now about the lesson, I want to talk about the lessons that you've learned through this time, which is maybe an unfair question, because even when somebody would ask me the question, like, well, what's the biggest takeaway from interviewing, like, coffee shop owners and things like that? Well, that's really difficult because there's so many. But what are the themes that would emerge from your writings about the culinary world, that these subjects are the most challenging things and maybe some that are really encouraging, but they're just through lines that you keep running into, stuff that's like, yeah, these are the super positive elements about this industry that keep coming up. And then there's some other challenges that need to have light shed on them. What would those be for you?
Wow, what a great question. And it's difficult to answer because I'm just myself, right? And I try to have a very open mind, but I still have my own personal gaze. And I certainly have to check that. But honestly, diversity inclusion has been a really important topic for media, for restaurants, for consumer packaged goods, and a constant theme for taste. Once we launched in 2017, we really, 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 really wanted to focus on the diversity of voices. This was certainly more interesting than covering the Kellers of the world. So I just found it good journalism, but I think we were ahead. This isn't tooting horns, it's just more objective than other in the media, because I think the media was still obsessed with a certain brand of chef. But for me, when we launched Taste in 16, we just thought like writing about sambal, for example. One of our first stories was about sambal and sambal olek. It's just like an ingredient that maybe back then even was less interesting to the mainstream food media, but we just found it taste that it was a cool topic to dive into deep. So everyone's caught up to that. And I think that's a huge theme. I think you look at every major food publication, you look at companies that have large headcounts, and you see the improvement of diversity inclusion. And I think that's something that we are always forever going to have in the top of mind when writing about food and looking at the space, and making sure we don't have inherent bias as editors and as writers, and making sure, one thing, this is super important, and I've worked with the crew at Studio Atao, which is an amazing nonprofit. We never want to put a writer into a box because of their background. So like, for example, we don't want to, if it's a Korean American writer, we don't want to only assume that that writer wants to write about Korean American cuisine or Korean cuisine. We want to make sure we reach out to a Korean American writer to talk about baked goods or yeast, or a story about baking. Like, we shouldn't, as writers or as editors, assume that because of the background, that's the only thing that somebody wants to write about and talk about. So I think that is a huge theme that I've seen, is that media has opened up our eyes to that importance.
It's really interesting. You mentioned earlier about scaling, checking impulse, and this is just maybe another thing that is also a check, and the theme of like slowing down long enough to like really examine your motives and the outcome of your actions, to make sure that whatever it is you step forward in doing is well thought through, instead of impulsive or inadvertently, kind of making creating an echo chamber, I guess.
Yeah. Never want to have an echo chamber. I think good journalism never has an echo chamber. I think it's good journalism steps out of your inherent bias, be it geographic bias or your background, and just wants to step out of that chamber. It's just more interesting. Chris, when it comes down to it, we're trying to write stories that people will find intriguing. And if we're doing all the same, it just isn't there.
It brings me back to this theme in coffee where we always talk about telling the story of the farmer. And we recently had an episode with a friend of mine, Costa Calavrosis, who talked about the tyranny of taste as the arbiter of quality, and how we define taste, in that it's not necessarily a conversation we involve producers in. And we're just like, we'll tell you what we want and you just kind of make it and stuff. So, and it's a good conversation to have in terms of, how are we allowing people to operate outside the boxes that we put on them? Although, they might be boxes that were like, hey, this will really sell, you should do this. Still, it seems like to give people autonomy and to be more equitable, it feels like that conversation at least needs to be platformed and had as a staple of the relationship.
Yeah.
So now, when it comes to what we in coffee, we look to the food industry, again, like I said in the beginning, we look to it as this idealized, like, man, they're just so established and People who've worked in the food industry are probably like, hey, you don't know. I mean, we're not that established or we're not that perfect, but it's easy to see the grass is greener. But there are lots of lessons to learn from vineyards, from craft spirits, and from the food industry. So I'm curious, as you are an enthusiast and connoisseur in your own right of coffee and also heavily in the food space, what is it that you wish coffee would pick up from the culinary world that maybe we haven't yet fully?
I mean, I hope this doesn't break the hearts of your listeners, but I mean, throw away that flavor wheel, man.
Oh,
I've thought of this through and I've talked about it on our show. I think the wine industry has gotten better. And I think it goes back to a little bit about, I spoke a little bit about simplicity. I think as we evolve, as like more and more people understand food and get into it, they want to actually talk about it. And when you pigeonhole a flavor assessment into like a wheel and you start getting into a tasting notes conversation, I think that really shuts off these very willing and eager participants in food culture. And I really firmly believe that the food industry has gotten really better. Food industry is a broad term, but like the restaurant or like CPG, or I think they've gotten really good at being direct with their consumers and offering a simple promise, this tastes good, versus this kind of pedantic, like almost like stunted, like elevated language that maybe back in like the 90s or the 2000s, it felt like that's what you needed to do as a successful food brand, is to prove these points that you have all of these data points for your product. But really when it comes down to it, is it good or not? So I think for coffee, and this goes back to my passion in just drinking coffee and talking to coffee producers, and I've been to farms like Jeff Watts is a good friend of mine, and I've gotten to travel with him to Origin, and I wrote about that for Taste. When you're in a van for 12 hours with Jeff Watts, you're talking about a lot of cool things about coffee. It was amazing, and honestly, it's like, is it good or not versus talking about bergamot? Because I think when you talk about bergamot and coffee, it's like it's automatic shut off. And I think, again, I said it from the front, like this is no disrespect to tasting. I think tasting is an art and a real science and takes a lot of skill. But I think a lot of the behind the scenes notes that roasters and coffee professionals need to have from the wheels gets pushed into the consumer. And I think that's a huge mistake.
What does it do that makes it a mistake? What's the downstream impact?
It's purely confusion. I think when you start trying to process this item that is a single color, similar viscosity, similar temperature from cup to cup to cup, it's just inherently challenging to get anyone, even the most like enthusiastic person, to get excited about different coffees if you're going to revert to, sour cherry, bergamot, and diesel fuel as like tasting notes. And I think the wine industry has certainly done this as well, but I think they've gotten better at being more straightforward. I think Ashley Rodriguez has written about this on Boss Barista and has written for Taste about this too. And I think she's great in assessing that, like meeting the consumer where they're at. And I just think, and she's been very clear about there's discussions behind the scenes and discussions for the customer, and knowing when to kind of shut it off is important.
It feels like we're trying to prove something to the customer about our professionalism or our knowledge by creating the necessity for them to listen to our taste and the notes diatribes about stone fruit and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. And it's great to be prideful about that. And it's great to have that experience and have that knowledge. I mean, cupping is super important. It's essential. And I think when you're training, it's obvious that you talk about these things. But I think that passion and that excitement being forced on the drinker. And again, this is like number one thing. We're talking about it's the same color, the same temperature relatively. We're talking about filter coffee here, of course. And same viscosity. There isn't a lot that you're giving people. And I think when you start to layer in like tasting notes, it becomes so much more confusing than helpful.
I totally agree with this. And
Okay, you do? Because you don't have to. I was just wondering,
oh
like,
no,
please.
I'm a big believer, and I would echo what Ashley has said here, and also just show that maybe a mark of insecurity on our part that kind of begs people to give us affirmations, imprison ourselves with affirmation by saying, like, we always want people to kind of like stroke our egos and be like, man, you called that bergamot note and I taste it. Wow. Corner pocket. Great job. But the point is really, and we say this in our mission statements, like it's for community and hospitality, but we don't have enough faith in our own customers for them to be able to determine what's good for them. So we kind of infantilize them and say, no, you have to go through, you have to swish it and make a weird sound, and then you'll appreciate coffee, which, yeah, that's basic gatekeeping 101, right?
It is. It's gotten better. Trust me, Chris. Like, I mean, I feel like it's, you walk into cafes and is it Dayglow or is it even Stumptown in some respects? I feel, I'm just naming off the dome, or East One in Brooklyn, really a favorite of mine. I love those guys in Carroll Gardens. Now, you're not getting that attitude. I think you're getting people who are open and who are, I mean, in terms of the hospitality. And I think coffee professionals, as they're younger, are maybe just more open-minded about being nice to people. I can't articulate why this is the case, and of course there's many counterexamples, but I just think we're in a very chaotic, busy world, and if someone asks you about a flavor, to like discount them because they don't understand a flavor wheel note, as opposed to just saying, hey, do you like this? Great. I mean, that's as simple as it gets. I think we're seeing progress.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm thinking about restaurants that, in these restaurants in particular might not have this as the goal, but the idea that the chef is the face of the company and that you want to have these open kitchens that show everything that's happening because the star and the light is all on that individual. Coffee bars are similar, where we have an open kitchen. And so it's easy to think of ourselves as the main character, like this is us. And it's all about this machine and me and my apron. And at the same time, it's like checking that impulse and saying, well, who is this actually for? And communicating in a way that edits, my impulse to talk about those notes and say, well, what do you think? And actually care what they think. And maybe even, God forbid, make decisions based on what they think.
God forbid the consumer is right. I mean, it's why I'm really impressed and drawn to Nigel Price and and formed a friendship with what he's done with Drip in his 3 locations in New York. And his staff there, his training is impeccable, and the people he employs are just under tough circumstances. New Yorkers are not easy customers at all, and certainly always rushed, which is crazy when you're trying to do like pour over concepts. I mean, he's like just doing the impossible. And certainly there's a lot of espresso served at these bars, at these shops. So he's doing both. But I think, talking to Nigel about coffee, he's a professional. I mean, he knows so much about coffee. He's tasted a lot of coffees, but he's always asking questions and always interested in what others will think. And he's just a really great example.
Yes, and that's genuine hospitality. It's as the classic Danny Meyer line from the Setting the Table book. Doing hospitality is doing it for somebody and not to them. And I agree. When it comes to that lesson, I really take what you're saying to heart. The flavor wheel and the things that we use as tools of our trade, back office stuff, keeping them back office, and then taking our energies and pouring them into finessing the customer-facing aspect and making it absolutely for them sounds like what's happening. I see that in coffee too. And maybe it takes a turning over of another generation to say, hey, we're going to introduce a new way of doing things.
Yeah.
In coffee, you mentioned how we talk to writers and how we talk about coffee, and maybe sometimes we don't do ourselves many favors. And it feels like a good time to kind of ask this question, but I'm curious what you mean when we talk to writers like yourself and people want to do stories on our coffee bars. How is it that we should be approaching these opportunities to really set ourselves up for success?
Wow. I mean, if there is a writer who is writing you and says, I would like to write an article, be it for Instagram, TikTok, or a publication like the New York Times on down. Yes, yes, yes. Like, I just feel like, there aren't that many food writers with the ability to promote their content who are into coffee, which is why I try to double down on it sometimes. And I think there's smart people who just get shut down when talking about coffee. Smart writers, they kind of clam up a little bit. Bill Addison at the LA Times has been, and I've been talking to Bill for a while about this. He just did a really nice coffee package for the LA Times.
Yeah.
And like Bill and I have been talking about coffee for a while, and he's like myself, extremely novice in terms of we've never worked in the industry. But we have an interest. And I think it's the pitching part that's challenging. And I know a lot of listeners have marketing departments or their own independent publicists. And it's hard because to pitch a general interest food section in your town or a television network or a podcast, wherever you want to get media for your shop, there's very few ways to get people cold excited about coffee, meaning like just off of a press release or a conversation. I think one thing that is often attempted is like the calendar, like, Valentine's Day latte specials and all that kind of stuff. Sure, get them in with that. I'm not against that kind of pitching, but I think that if you can get people like writers like myself excited about filter coffee and deviating the two and talking about what coffee actually tastes like and how to make coffee and like that kind of world, and maybe shy a little bit away from the espresso and espresso art. I've gone on record many times. I'm very pro filter. Espresso, I think, is wonderful for money, but that's about it for my tastes. But try to get that filter conversation in there. And I think if you find the right writer and the right outlet, they might take advantage of your offer, that is.
Yeah. The idea of focusing on filter coffee versus espresso is interesting because a lot of people will say, hey, we do latte art here. Isn't that cool? And we have these espresso beverages. And I'm curious why you wouldn't kind of lead with that.
I think it's a sugar rush, no pun intended. I think that the media you're going to get from that is going to not further your establishment beyond kind of a funny, weird, like, mention. Of course, don't turn down press. And I think there's a Trojan horse element here. So maybe I'm talking two ways with this topic, but to really focus on latte art as like your main mission for media seems like you're selling yourself short. And if you do land that media, you're not going to get the hit that you actually like, which is talking about your farmers, talking about the coffee you're roasting, the coffees you're selling, the equity in your business, all the things that you have a lot of passion for. Now, latte art is cool, but I think starting with like more of a broader conversation is a diversity inclusion efforts for your cafe. Maybe that's a broader story for a food desk. I think there's a lot of talk about Black coffee and the Black community getting, representing coffee. I think there's certainly origin and talking about Latin America and how origin plays into the conversation and Latinx coffee owners and baristas and kind of lean into that a little bit more with your pitching. Those stories I feel are going to get the stories that you really are going to be proud of versus, we have a cool latte special.
Well, when you put it like that, the contrast is pretty striking.
Yeah.
So that's well said. Yeah, I appreciate that.
I don't know if it's well said, and people, please don't send me hate mail. I'm trying to be productive here and speaking about something I don't know a ton about, because I think there's small business owners who, if you get 10 extra customers because of a latte art feature, like, please, that's amazing. I'm not trying to say don't do that. I'm just saying you're so passionate as an owner of a store to like start the conversation with latte art. I feel that's maybe not going to get you what you want.
Well, and to add to that, like if you're thinking that this is your one and only opportunity, that would be a misstep, right? Because it feels like a larger kind of a lifestyle of like putting out there what your business is doing. So it's not just that you would, say we have a sweetheart special for Valentine's Day. It's also that later on, we're going to talk about the fact that we're getting this coffee, here's the story, here's what we're passionate
Yeah.
about. So it's both and. But if you're just like saying, well, silver bullet this year is going to be this thing, yeah, okay, that's maybe a little bit myopic.
Yeah, I agree. Can I ask you a couple
Oh
questions?
yeah.
Is that okay? I feel like this is an opportunity I need to take, and maybe your listeners will enjoy this because I've just been thinking a lot about Blank Street, and it's an easy thing to hate. Personally, this is me speaking, no one else. I'm sorry if there's Blank Street people listening to this, but it seems extremely detrimental to coffee in New York City. Am I wrong?
Detriment. Oh, so there's I think the first thought I have is the question unto what? What is the whole point of this? At first, yeah, I think, and maybe I would say, even after thinking about it, think this, that it's a business opportunity. We do it because we can, and we are doing it. And they're trying to say, from what I've read, that it's taking coffee to lots of different places with automation, that we're agile, we're small footprint, real estate's expensive, and we're just doing this because we want to, canvas the world with coffee. Except it's going into places where there's already coffee shops. I'd say
Correct.
that kind of falls down right there. It's a bid for business. I don't really believe in the ethos of what is said. I think that's just something you say.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, it is not very good quality because it can't be.
Confirmed.
Right? Like, and that would be true if it was an independent coffee shop starting to try to do the same thing, because there are certain laws of operational physics, which doesn't exist, but it where that kind of expansion inevitably brings about not only an inconsistency, but a certain culture of accepting lower quality under the value of consistency. So, or is consistently bad doesn't make it great. And so it doesn't seem sustainable to me. And I think I know a couple of people that may work within that world. And no shade to them, honestly, because it is a job, and it's probably a good paying job.
Yeah, insurance. I mean, hopefully some profit sharing, a 401k at least. Yeah, I respect
There's those big jobs that people will take, and I say you have a family and you have mouths to feed or whatever. But the end result, if we had to dig it up 100 years from now and say, was this a net benefit for the coffee community? I'm very skeptical. I'd probably land on no at this point.
Great. Second question. I've asked Ashley Rodriguez, James Hoffman, Nigel, who we mentioned Price from Drip, and I just like to get your take on this because it's always on my mind. I think I've asked Jeff this too. How much should a cup of coffee be that has been sourced, that has been hand brewed, and that has been well articulated on a menu, and that's absolutely delicious?
Well, the question means ideally versus should being, to me, there's two things: ideal, and then there's real.
Yeah. Smart. That's why you do this for a living.
So ideally, we're like, oh, a lot, like $12. And then there's places where you can get that. And there's called the pour over bar. If you have batch and you're paying $3 a pound for the main drinkers every day for a pretty well sourced Colombian, right? And it's a reasonable cost. It's an average. Even $4 or $5 right now is average in specialty coffee. But then you go in and you want to buy a $15, $16 cup of coffee. Okay, that is there on the menu as a special thing because people can't afford at this point, whether you believe that is a mentality or a literal constraint, to drink that every day. Now, you can go to a place in New York and have people that are buying things every single day that it would shock me. I'd be like, how much are you spending a year on coffee? It's a lot. So it's a value proposition. So maybe it goes back to how we communicate about coffee in that,
Great answer. Back to New York, I just feel it's just such a affordable luxury. I mean, if you're selling a COE coffee from Panama for $14 for like a super skillfully brewed cup, I mean, it's still $14. You're you're paying that for a macro brew, a Coors Light at a lot of bars in New York, or $12, whatever. So I just feel like that articulating that this is the most affordable luxury, you're getting the best in the world of something for only $12, and that instead of it being like, this is 4x what I'm used to paying, as opposed to like, this is going to be the best cup of coffee you're going to have this month. It's going to change the way you think about flavor profile. It's a naturally processed coffee, so maybe it's going to be wild and totally different, drink more like tea for like the average drinker. And it seems to me there's a hesitation to put those prices on menus. Again, I'm New York, LA, San Francisco, so this is not necessarily going to play out, but maybe it's $9 in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's like at the end of a hard week, I love coffee so much. I drink it every day. I'm going to go to your cafe and have that $9 cup because I deserve it.
Well, where does the money go after that transaction is another question. And how much did you pay for it?
Sure.
So if it's just a matter of, we paid a lot for this, so we have to charge a lot, that's one thing. If there's margin on top of it that you're going to actually put back into the ecosystem there and back to the farmer, that's even better. But also, I think where we are going to be ready to start charging consistently more for coffee is when we stop only charging a lot for novel experiences. That maybe it is that bergamot bomb with the cherry pie aftertaste and whatnot. And we feel like, oh, that's so special and weird and good. We're going to charge a lot of money for that. And so it's this easy thing, like doing a tasting with a consumer and saying, I want you to taste this dark roast Sumatra. Now taste this Ethiopia Harar and, blueberries. Oh my gosh, that's an easy win. But if we're talking earlier about the emotional connection and serving the customer based on the value that they put on the coffee they're drinking, even though it's not our favorite, would we be willing to charge $9 to $10 in Madison, Wisconsin for a more developed and maybe much maligned Sumatran, that is typically not seen as the kind of coffee that you would charge a lot of money for, but it's valuable to the consumer. Therefore, shouldn't that reflect the value that we give it in the price?
Yeah, the great points. I mean, it's an either
Right.
or, I think, but and I think passing on, the money that is the extra money, like the money on top of the margin to the farmer, is certainly something that I try to talk about with my work as much as possible. I know it's with the trade and with so many channels and so many people touching coffee, it's near impossible to do that. But it seems like,
yeah.
it's something
Well,
talk
back to your
about.
point about having single establishments versus scaling, I think the infrastructure that we require to
Totally.
deliver coffee to consumers often is overwrought a little bit. And maybe the simplicity of service and depth of operations can allow for more margin in that way.
Can I ask you one more question?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, please.
One more question is, in America, where are you seeing just an incredibly exciting coffee shop scene right now that if I'm going there, I should definitely, like maybe look on Sprudge or do some research and see and hit up 4 or 5 places and be like super surprised and excited.
I would say for me, the first thing that popped into my mind was South LA and Cafe Calle. We've had the owner on the show before as a Founder Friday episode. Down in South Central, it's Salvadorian neighborhood. It is coffee that is served there, comes from roasters who source directly from Central South American coffees that they themselves represent that community. And I would say in that area, that's where the most authentic kind of, I would say that word lightly, I suppose, service with an eye to serve the neighborhood great coffee without pretense exists in that I enjoy going to, because I don't have to sift through, I don't have to genuflex at the doorway before I go in, if you will, right? So that in particular, so I'll shout out Cafe Calle, and in cafes like that, you've got Cafe in Kansas City in Missouri, where Jackie Wen opened this as a Vietnamese themed coffee shop where it was a coffee cart. I worked with her briefly as a coach, but it's really just taken off, and she has a brick and mortar now. It started off as a trailer. It is community expression. And so when you get
I love
places
that.
like that, be they in rural middle America or on the coast and whatnot, that have a community focus and seek to relieve themselves of the pretense in order to create the magic between the customer and the person behind the counter. I think those places are exciting. And that can exist in big, fancy places that just have all the tropes too. I mean, succulents and white tiled walls and blonde wood. You could still find that. It's harder because we're a little bit jaded towards those experiences. But if we seek out humanity in the midst of all of those different elements, I think you're going to find good places.
I love it. The spot in South LA reminds me of La Perlita doing Reforma Coffee in
Oh,
Portland.
okay.
Sounds similar.
I
I don't know
don't.
if you know those guys. That's a good spot. I really like that in Portland. Reforma.
Cool stuff.
Good stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so I have one last question for you. And that is,
Yeah.
we in coffee we're made fun of for our food.
You mean like the pastries at the counter, or like the
Well, it's
avocado
avocado
toast?
toast. It's the quote unquote breakfast burritos. Although I'll say, go get 'em Tigers breakfast burrito in LA. It's really amazing.
Sick. Shout out
Yeah.
to GGT,
And so
man.
I will
Yeah.
say that by and large, though, we're just like really BFFs with Cisco and the like. And for some people have no other options. But how do we create a little bit more of a forward progress with the way we approach food in our cafes? How do you see these industries kind of playing together, moving into the future?
Wow. Great question. I feel like, I think East One, again, I mentioned them in Carroll Gardens. They have like a restaurant attached to their cafe, so they have that ability. And I think if there's a way to have some kind of service element that is beyond handing you a sheet of paper filling a burrito or whatever, or like wrapping a burrito, if there's any kind of service that you're going to really pay, it's going to pay dividends. So if there's a way to, and I know, of course, there's plenty of spaces and owners who listen who don't have that ability. So maybe it's irrelevant to them. But if you have the ability to even open a small cafe that you can actually have service, then do it. In terms of like the menu development at the places that have that ability, it's such a good question, because I think with coffee, you certainly have a limited amount of food that works. It seems like if you overshoot, it could be disastrous. Like I love pho. I think it's a great breakfast, but I don't know if I, as a general consumer, want pho with my coffee. But I love pho, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm speaking about my own personal bias, but I feel like if there's a way to generate a buzzworthy moment with your food program that aligns with your coffee values, hard to do that. But if there's a way to bring in a guest chef, rotating chefs quarterly, giving somebody who's maybe big on TikTok or Instagram an opportunity to expand their horizon at your space. Is it a baker that is a home baker, but they can adapt to do something at the cafe level? I think that's exciting. It's a good media story and very pitchable. But I think it comes down to service. And if I know I'm going into your cafe and I'm not just getting a number that I plop down at my table and I have to go up and have someone like, throw the plates at me, like I'm going to go there more often than not.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we often will herd people more than serve them in a lot of ways with coffee.
I mean, the guys at GGET and what they were doing at the Market Grand Central, that's service. Like those, I mean, it's like you're offering, some really like great touch points at when you're giving them their latte or giving them their cold drink. So I think it's like looking at just the small things and does that extend to the food program? I feel like not looking past them, but looking at them and saying like, what do you need? Would you like a glass of water? I mean, simple things like that, and training your staff to ask these simple things, or you can just go in the back, get some water, even if it's for a small scone or a donut or something. Offering water in a napkin is a really huge moment, and I would remember that as a diner versus it just being thrown into a sleeve and thrown at you.
Agreed. Well, let's hope that can. I know there's places out there that are employing that kind of intentionality, and I hope that it catches on and becomes really thematic and the biggest takeaway what people get when they think of specialty coffee. Got a long way to go with that. But yeah, Matt, obviously there's so much more to talk about. This is why there are lots of articles and podcasts that you have that we need to read, your books as well. So tell us a little bit about how we can stay in touch with all you do in that world.
Thanks, Chris. Well, it's been a real honor and just a great conversation. And again, I have so much respect for the industry and single business owners. As a child of parents who ran businesses, it's just such a beautiful thing you're doing. Taste you can find at tastecooking.com. That's our website, and that points to our newsletter. I suggest subscribing to that. It's free and it's easy, and it'll get you all the information. It'll also get you our podcast feed, and I think the Taste podcast is updated 2 to 3 times a week, and you can check that out at all the places you find podcasts, where you're finding Keys to the Shop, where you're finding all your great coffee content.
Awesome. Matt, thank you so much for spending time with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. It's been great.
Okay, everybody. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And if anything, I hope that you walk away with the idea that being in an industry that is all about hospitality and communicating value to the consumer, along with that comes the need to constantly be checking ourselves for accurate reflection of the value of the product we're serving through the way we serve it to the consumer, how we are having these hurting people, we're serving them on an individual basis. We also want to make sure that through the way we're serving people, the way we source our products, the way we respect those products in the creation process, and the way we curate our menus, and how we equip people to enjoy it through our conveying of knowledge, whether that's through a cookbook or giving recommendations for people on, maybe some ways to brew the coffee at home. There's a lot we can do to break down barriers. And maybe like Matt said, one of the things is this tasting wheel and learning how to keep the inside baseball stuff inside and create a more robust customer-facing experience that energizes our guests rather than requiring them to expend so much energy. So some really great thoughts here, and a huge thank you to Matt Rodbard for being my guest on the show today. If you're interested in learning more about what Matt does and reading articles and listening to the podcast, Taste Podcast, the perfect place to go would be over at tastecooking.com. Of course, you could also follow them on Instagram at Taste, and then again on LinkedIn. Really easy to find Taste Cooking and the podcast and Matt's books. Again, a huge thank you to Matt for being on the show. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback about today's episode, go ahead and email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. It's where you can do that. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one with Keys to the Shop Consulting to help you bring clarity, solutions, and systems for sustainability, freedom, and joy in the process of running a great coffee shop, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. You can use that same email to reach out and set up a free discovery call with me, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, you've heard me talk about Coffee Fest, right? Coffee Fest is a trade show. It's been going on for 30 years, offering some of the best education and resourcing in the industry. I honestly do think if you go to a Coffee Fest trade show, you're going to walk away better than when you arrived. You're going to have great information, insights, tools to succeed in running your coffee shop. Lectures, trainings, workshops, panel discussions. There's all sorts of opportunities to learn from industry experts on a range of subjects during each of the Coffee Fest trade shows. Check it out at coffeefest.com to learn more about upcoming shows in Louisville, Kentucky, Anaheim, California, and Orlando, Florida. I'm going to be presenting at all of these shows coming up and also judging latte art. So I hope you say hello. But when you register, you can use the code KEYS, KEYS, to get 50% off your registration. You sign yourself and your team up for this event. Again, don't forget to use the code KEYS when you register. And again, I hope to see you there. It really is worth your while. Great community, great content, great vendors on the show floor. It just is a fantastic experience. Again, check them out over at coffeefest.com. And with that, that is the end of our show today, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to sit in on this conversation with myself and Matt Rodbard, all about cooking, all about food and coffee and writing and just the craft of how we convey these things to our guests and how we can do better in that respect. It's really a great conversation. So thanks for being here with us for that. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.